Hello, everyone. So I see that there are a few people there. So my name is Malterre-Barthes. I'm an architect and an urban designer. And I'm currently teaching at ETH Zurich, and I'll be joining Harvard GSD as assistant professor in the fall. I'm here together with Dubravka Sekulic, which is an assistant professor at TU Graz, and she's a PhD fellow at the Department of Architecture at ETH. That's where we met and where we started our troublemaking. And we're being joined as a special guest by Khensani De Klerk, who's a South African architect, currently pursuing her master in architecture and urban design at Cambridge. And she's the founder of Malterre-Barthes, which is an intersectional collective that brings African women of color together for the empowerment and development of African cities within the realm of spatial education. So with that, I first, of course, thank the Architectural Foundation for giving us the platform, and I will start to share my screen. So we would like to start with this collage. As we mentioned earlier, this is a collage that has been, let's say, produced especially for us by Ciro Miguel, who is a friend and an architect and a visual artist and a photographer. And as you see, it's called Squashing the Canon. And I think it's just a way to playfully enter one part of the topic, which we stole, or let's say appropriated, which is very bad, from Dismantling the Master's House, bringing intersectionality to the architecture school. You would recognize Audre Lorde's famous sentence about dismantling the master's house and how the tools of the masters are actually not the right tools to do that. So we will also try to discuss this. The talk is structured in 3 parts: gender in architecture, activism in design institutions, tactics and strategies, and then curriculum revolution, bringing intersectionality to architecture. And then a conversation and hopefully some questions from the audience. So architecture is a very male-dominated, let's say, discipline. It still believes strongly into the masterclass culture. Male designs the built environment. This is a kind of architecture then type of imagery that shows this kind of black and white group of guys looking at models. Something that we all think is a little bit old-fashioned. However, architecture now is perhaps not of a far stretch from that time then, and I'm sure Ellis would appreciate that there are some friends of him around that model. So as you see, this is not a situation that has drastically changed. There are, let's say, proof that this is actually ongoing. There are people who have been like tirelessly also recording this situation. Maybe you know this blog called All Male Panels, and they've been chronicling, you know, how this kind of serial offense is repeating across all aspects of the discipline. Say from the Biennale, those are past Biennales, but you see this kind of typical all male panels. So here I have a kind of representation issues. Then in our own institution, so where Dubravka and I met, and where, which been my alma mater for, or my academic home as well for almost 10 years, which is the ETH Zurich. It's basically a paragon of macho culture. And here you see a program for public lecture series organized by the department in the spring semester 2016. And if you pay a bit of attention, the gender ratio is actually very clearly strictly male. There is only one event that should attract your attention, and those are the Parity Talks 2016. Basically, I will dive a little bit into that afterwards, onto how we at least manage or try to craft a space within the architecture department to discuss gender and diversity within the discipline. I just want to give a kind of rough picture of what's the situation. So this is the entire list of professorships at the architecture department of architecture. There are 7 women appointed. 2 are on short period appointments of 6 years. 2 are on the verge of retirement. And here you have 35 professorships. So the last appointment is actually a female. I think the last 2 appointments are female. Sorry, I'm having trouble here. So yes, this is the situation, the last appointments. And here is the stand 2020, so it's updated. You have 9 women appointed, and still out of the 10 new appointments, only 2 are women. So that's the kind of situation. 40 professorships, 9 women, 10 new appointments, 2 women, and diversity ratio of 2/40. The teaching culture in technical school in general and in architecture in particular remains largely embedded in a patriarchal male-dominated realm. Even representation is rather fraught. This was an imagery that was published in the, let's say, local in-house magazine. Typically, you have 40% female students in architecture and some 20 in civic engineering, but this doesn't repercolates in the higher level of the hierarchy. This is the gender monitoring of the school. If you pay attention, it's actually kind of pyramidal. You have almost an equal amount of male and female students at bachelor level. This kind of stretch a little bit in the master level. This is 2014, but still this is very valid, even though the gap kind of stretches. And then there is kind of this giant gap between professors with 88% against 12. This is the situation, the latest one. So they call this the leaky pipeline because they talk about the fact that they're losing the people who study, who don't actually really re-emerge in the higher stratas. So you have almost an equal amount of like a balance of gender at the level of students, and then that kind of is being drastically changed as you go into power, more powerful position, assistant professor and let's say tenured professor. Of course, the glass ceiling index is also very telling. As you see, it's actually even getting very slowly down. So there is a kind of underrepresentation of women among full professors. Those are kind of just the boring numbers so that those who are into numbers can see that the situation is bad. Here, more numbers, what they call the super durable Swiss glass ceiling. You see this kind of very pink thin line. This is the amount of professors by gender across the entire school, across the entire existence of the school. It stops in 2014. It's not, I can guarantee you that it's not COVID-like. It's actually a rather, flattening the curve. I don't know. This is bad, poor analogies, but you get the point. I'm not going to dive into the fact that the first female professor was actually appointed in 68 and things like that. So I'm just moving on to the second part, which is basically how we tried to make things better. So maybe as a footnote, and I think that there might be some colleagues of us here in the audience, but and Dubravka can also help me there because she was there. There was a momentum around 2014 where a bunch of students and assistants and doctoral students got really fed up with the situation. I mean, we're talking about all male panels. We're talking about entire lineup of jury in front of critics of just like male. There is one famous one that we always bring because it's very evocative, which was one studio which had like 6 male architects dressed in black, facing like one student And then we were just like, well, I mean, this in general it was a problem, but this was kind of, I think, the last drop. And out of that, we started to organize, basically. So we started to hold meetings, and we started to see how we could start to challenge that situation. So there were kind of people getting together. There were people who had contact with like student newspapers, so they kind of made a paper. They wrote a paper in 2014 that was kind of saying, you know, what's going on. The ETH has a women problem. So we created, in parallel to that, we created this what we call the Parity Group. So I would date it to December 2014. And the first output was a discussion platform. So we were very cautious. We were like, well, you know, no one is really talking about that. There's no ally, no professors, no one is really interested. However, there was, and there is an organ within the school, which is called the Department Conference, which has representative of the staff, representative of the students, and all the professors. And that organ kinds of dictates, not really, but allows for certain occurrence to happen at the school. So the first step was actually to become a representative. So that's what a few of us did, and became a representative of the staff. And then with that, proposed a platform. I mean, at the time we were extremely shy, as I said. So a platform, we had like some 80 people signing a petition saying we want to bring that discussion, the discussion on gender within the departments. This was accepted, voted. Meanwhile, there were other people who were pressing. So you had a kind of double pressure from, let's say, outside, from like the press, inside, outside, plus that element, and somehow that convinced the department to allow for the first parity talks to happen, which is was the first, let's say, space to bring the topic of gender in the school. It was actually quite a big event. It's I have to say that, to give credit to the department, they always paid for it. They were always generous and never really, I mean, also controlled what was happening in the event. So I think because at the time they thought it was irrelevant. I don't know, I'm just making assumptions, but in any case, so so this was the first one. It was just plainly let's talk about it. It brought professors and staff and students together, and out of this there was a recommendation that came out. There were what was called the 9 points for parity, which have been updated still then. And the first one, the first demand was to create the so-called parity board, which was something that would be in the statutes of the school to discuss the topic of parity and diversity within the school. Second, we asked for a monitoring, and not a monitoring at the level of the kind of what you saw before, this kind of generic graphics, but we asked for something that was actually monitoring the school really, and the professorships even, and their hiring policies, and, you know, the kind of crits, the parity at crits, and so on and so forth. And then we asked, of course, for parity at level of professorship, of lectureship, of senior researcher assistants, guest critics, and seminar. We also asked for parity within the search committees. We asked for integration of gender and diversity matters within the curriculum and the research. And then we asked for an award program for gender topics, travel grants, and then a fellowship, and then in the end, something like gender parity and student awards, which are very highly contextual things. But so this was the first outcome. Meanwhile, we were, of course, facing resistance from the inside. This is actually the dean of the school at the time. It was Annette Spiro. And she gave an interview to the magazine Parterre, which is one of the important architectural magazine in the Swiss German speaking world, where she basically said, we have too less female applicants, you know, women don't apply, and that's why we don't have women in the school at the level of the department. She actually criticized, she's against the idea that one would do a gender topic within research. She thinks there is no such thing as female or male architecture. And she said, quote, it sounds like you would differentiate architect by skin color. I'm against it. So I see no reason for doing this, she said. I refuse to accept this. So we were kind of in a situation where, while the department was kind of supportive, they were also not really supportive, in fact. So we did other things. We did a publication, for instance, which was about looking for portraits of potential candidates, something that I think many other colleagues who are working at the, let's say, at or activists within this question of gender, they have you know, made catalogs, and you know, I'm thinking about Rebel Architects, or even the book of Jane Hall with building grounds, where you can tell, breaking grounds, that you cannot say that there is no female architects. I mean, this is kind of just not true, basically. So we went on with the second Parity Talks, which happened in 2017, which was the idea to assess progress and maintain the topic on the agenda. And this one is called Learning from Institutional Practice and Working Tools. So here we invited fellow colleagues from Parler, also from KTH Stockholm, people from Fatal, and then we also asked help from other institutions. We had the city of Zurich who came in, and a few others who were kind of looking at institutional strategies for gender parity and diversity, and how to implement measures. So we discussed institutional structure, gender monitoring, women's visibility, career development and mentoring, and things like that. Out of that, the department kind of agreed to implement the gender action plan, which is actually an empty shell unless you implement it. So for us, it was a semi-victory, but out of that came this idea of creating the parity board, which we already asked very early onwards, was actually starting to gain traction. We kept on publishing top, let's say, articles where we were trying to, you know, chronicle this. This is actually also been published in the magazine Site. So if you're interested, it's reachable online. It was published as well in Trans, which is the internal organ, or let's say the magazine of the school. And the text actually asks, isn't it surprising that the urgent question of the gender and diversity at ETH Zurich has been left to individual initiative to be addressed? How come so little was done on these matters prior to our engagement? Is institutional inertia inherent to big institutions? So we're basically not letting go. Following that, somehow that board was finally created. It's sort of an intern lobbying organ. It was acted in the statute of the school in 2017, and its mandate is to steer the department towards a better situation and to implement this gender action plan. And you have 2 representatives at the professor level, 2 representatives at the assistant and researcher levels, and 2 representatives at the student level. This is the current stand. I'm actually about to leave, so I will be replaced by Amy Perkins. And I don't know exactly how it's going to go on, but basically that organ is within, it's like, you know, in French you say the wolf is in the sheep shed, I guess. So we moved into hosting the third Parity Talks, which were called Role Models. Here we discussed research, histories, technologies, and pedagogies, and practice. So we also try to kind of have a broader let's say, range of material. I'm going to speed up. Here we reach something that we called parity fatigue, which is a moment where you say nothing is changing, they're just using us, we hate everyone, why am I doing this? And then somewhere in the way, the school and the department was actually faced by a case of sexual harassment. And that was actually the moment where the school and the department, even though it has always been supportive, I think that there was a kind of mutual instrumentalization. The school instrumentalized the Parity Talks to somehow try to tackle the question, and we instrumentalized the school to bring forward the agenda. And this means that the scale of the event was way bigger, and it was became a kind of a much bigger event. We have in our drag series Alvaro Siza. The topic is making excellent work, which is actually a bit of a I mean, it's kind of a scratch to this excellency culture, which has been always brought forth to argue against the fact that women are not being appointed. So it's kind of a multi-scalar attack. it was fun because Alvaro Siza himself said that he think he would look more beautiful with this intervention. So it was nice to be also getting some kind of fun accolades. And the program was actually very big. There were like discussion about gender parity in the Swiss context, situated science, leadership, unconscious bias, equal opportunities, and so on. So it's kind of it was hosted by the Institute of Technology and Architecture, kind of big room, large amount of people. Here we enforced some of the measures that were also appearing at the 9 points for parity. There's an internal rule of conduct. That's actually something that the department did on its own. So they kind of reacted also to the situation. And then we also had this rule that actually you should have 50-50, at least in gender, for the crits. And that's going to be also monitored. So every semester you also had this announcement. So I'm going to speed up, actually, because this is so it's just talking about the monitoring and how we without finger pointing, but we just kind of keep watching and closely inspect. So these points of parity, and just to kind of bridge now to our conversation. The conversation on diversity is something that is also very much bottom up. I was just discussing with my colleagues earlier and said how a student that was in second year asked one of the professors, so we're talking bachelor, he asked, why is your curriculum so Eurocentric? And so I think that the fact that students are actually pointing this, and this is something that you see in this kind of pie chart, which is probably not accurate, and it's also very always very sensitive to monitor these things. But here you see the portion of bachelor that are Swiss, non-Swiss, but it actually says non-Swiss residents. So I don't know exactly to which extent this is believable. But you see in 2018, you already have a quarter of like non-Swiss people, but somehow even that is not really, I mean, if you were to base a kind of argumentation on whether this should percolate into the curriculum, it's not the case at all, because actually I think that the answer to this professor to the question, why is your curriculum so Eurocentric, he was like saying that the important things happen in Europe. I think that's what he answered. So the Parity Talks the fifth one, actions and accountability, was postponed because of the sanitary crisis. It is postponed, so it will happen again, but I want to basically jump into what we were discussing at that time, and that will also allow me to introduce again Khensani, which is with us. But the topic this time, we said we're just doing a workshop, and this is going to be extremely performative. We're looking at how the institution has been like not reacting or what could be done. So here you have these 5 workshops are addressing the culture of silence in the school at large. So not only the architecture department, it's addressing these structural issues around gender discrimination, hierarchy, misconduct, and works towards proposal. So the idea was, I think, here to write a letter to the president. So this is still very much on track. The second one was called Table Manners, Investigating Structures of Critique. So this is about challenging actually the pedagogy and how we're being assessed as architecture students, or how architecture students are being assessed. Challenging the curriculum, which we see in the next part of the presentation, but with very much questioning pedagogy. It's called Pedagogy in Motion, and it's of course talking about content, but also methods. The fourth workshop, which Khensani and Solange were actually part of, and myself, is called Defining Diversity, 100 Questions. So this was about defining diversity, because I think the context of the school is also difficult. So how do you actually tackle these things? People assume that there's absolutely zero issue. And then the fifth one is called Building Parity, and was basically coming up with a new studio. And all of this was basically about asking, what does it take to change paradigms of gender and diversity in architecture? So this is postponed. It's going to happen 6 and 7 October. It's very much likely that it will be online for obvious reasons. So I'm just going to conclude here about that part, which is this activism in design institution. I think that what we've attempted to do, and perhaps to a certain extent succeeded in doing, is to create a space where it's now relatively safe and accepted to discuss matters of gender and diversity. We also have embedded the topic in the institutional discourse as an urgent matter. We also have, in a way, hijacked the institution prestige. I think that this is also very interesting. I had conversation with people who were saying, you know, we are watching what the ETH is doing, and this is extremely important to also send signals towards other institutions that are actually not tackling the problems, even though the school is very much behind in comparison to other schools that are already working on their curriculum. So in a way, it's basically delivering the message that the current modus operandi is not acceptable and that it should change. So with this, I will just quickly introduce the last curriculum revolution, which is in a way, to give a bit of context, an extension of this parity and diversity work that I presented. In a way, this institutional work is born out of a gender issue because the school is so far behind. So that's a very contextual aspect, but it quickly became clear that it has to encompass broader questions, and that's something that both Dubravka and myself had been working on, and this idea and this relevance of the question of intersectionality. So I think, Dubravka, if you, I can keep the shared screen, and you can just.
Then yeah, I can signal you. Thank you for this. What I think here what is really interesting or important is that to understand that what Charlotte was saying, how a lot of this work is really contextual, and that a lot of this understanding and motivation to make an intervention really stems from like kind of entering an institution and realizing things. And for me, this happened when I came to ETH in 2013 as a PhD student, and I was like, oh, wow, this is so patriarchal and male. But what was also was, oh, wow, this is so rich. And while there were people on the fringes who were, there were people, you then realize that there are people who are from a, you know, middle class, working class background. But what for me was striking was that how little people of ex-Yugoslav origin were present at the architecture school or at the ETH in total, where that is one of the largest immigrant groups for 20, 30 years in Switzerland. So that's one of the things that I kind of think that was important, that we kind of called it parity, thinking that this parity can stand in for a lot of different things and not just to focus on gender, because only if we do an intersectional intervention, we can actually start to attack the idea that how we teach and how we practice is actually more or less made as a system according to one specific identity, which is what white male affluent identity. So when Anna Shapiro says there is no other architecture, she probably is right, because there is the dominant architecture. There is one dominant architecture, but we need, in a way, to break it and challenge. So in 2016, I left Zurich and I moved to Graz. And then I had yet another wow moment, realizing, okay, it's possible to go in a way backwards, even more to certain, because for TU Graz, ETH Zurich is this big thing that they are looking at as a site of influence. And then I became aware even more how, as a woman coming from ex-Yugoslavia, in Austria specifically, which sees this territory as its extension of its empire, I'm a body that doesn't carry knowledge. I can, and which even my kind of ETH credential does not kind of make a lot of difference. So how to make an intervention there? Then it became a lot of kind of what. So Charlotte and I were talking a lot, and then this idea of a curriculum revolution came up. Also out of partial frustration of looking at the certain things. So this was, for example, this was a proposal, and we were selected then to do this thing at a future architecture platform, which also came out of a bit annoyance of following future architecture and projects that were being proposed there for a couple of years, and realizing that the topics that appear there are not necessarily are still repeating a lot of this European centric. You could see the trends in the architecture schools that were a lot about automation, that were a lot about various issues, but how the issues of understanding that architecture operates as one of the big tools of racial capitalism are not really present when you will see that. So this kind of curriculum revolution was about a vehicle for Charlotte and I in order to start to kind of have something that we kind of can talk about and what we can influence and build on. But also with this idea that this is some kind of a Trojan horse with which you try to make yourself part of certain conversations that you don't necessarily can. So out of our presentation in Ljubljana came an invitation to do something in Oslo, the Oslo Architecture Triennial, where we then proposed and the organized 2-day reading group, for which we chose to read together with people the text from 1981 called Women's Environmental Rights Manifesto, which was written by Leslie Kane, who was in the late 70s and early 80s, really active in the US, trying to build up women's planning schools, trying to build up alternative education system, but also trying to build alternative spaces. And interestingly, this text, for example, was originally published in Heresies, which was a feminist fanzine that was published from late 70s. So for us, it was important to choose this text in order to connect this with the previous struggle and to build with the previous knowledges that were existing, in order to also understand that there are precursors that we can build on, and also that we can also understand that they also had some limits, and to understand their limits and how this. And what was interesting in Oslo is that especially the second session of that reading room turned out into some kind of a group therapy session, if I may say, because it was really something that was, how do you start to talk about these things? And then how do you start to talk about these things in a context, for example, which, because it's a strong welfare state, has certain expectations that things are solved, and those certain issues don't need to address. So genders not necessarily you don't need to address gender so directly, but other issues pop up. And this was important because when I see the work of Parity Group as a really understanding this is the institution in which we are intervening, and in order to intervene in this particular institution, this is the set of strategies and conversations we need to start to have, which doesn't necessarily mean that these are the same sets of conversations and intervention. But what I think is really important is to understand that all of this work comes with trying to set up collaborative transformative process. Because what we are trying to, in a way, do is to unlearn the architecture as we know it, by also having to unlearn patriarchy, imperialism, colonialism, or all these things which we can name racial capitalism. And that the only way we can do this is to try to open spaces and crack and show. And maybe, Charlotte, you can move to the next.
Yeah, the next.
Yeah. And I think that then it really becomes understanding where can we make an interventions. And maybe, Charlotte, you can introduce this initiative that teaches
maybe I need to kind of give a bit of a footnote on the Parity Group, because I think the Parity Group is an important organ. I mean, it's actually it doesn't exist as a. It's not an association. It doesn't have any legal existence. It's not even you know. It's just a kind of a organ that you call into action to legitimize actions within the school. So the Parity Group exists as a kind of entity. You can. It has, for instance, it's the people who do it. So for instance, at the moment, I have access to the mailing list of the entire department. So I will pass that to the people who are in the Parity and Diversity Commission, but only the assistants. So this is a kind of organ of assistance. Also the students can get it, of course, but not the professors. And then it's kind of it's been funded by a certain amount of people, but in the meantime, it has basically everyone. It's a bit like if I touch you, you become part of the Parity Group. It's like everyone who ever showed any kind of interest to join the conversation is basically automatically part of the Parity Group. So it's a kind of a almighty, albeit completely organic structure. And this is important to say because people come and go in institutions. So I will leave. Dubravka is 1 foot out. Many of our colleagues are already gone. I see that a few of them are actually here in the audience, and they are now, you know, in TU Munich or in Frankfurt, in other places across Europe. And in a way, they carry the work on their own as well. They also do their part. So I think that it's interesting that it's also about dissemination. And maybe this one is just an example. It's a call that that we launched. So the Parity Group kind of launched it, but it's endorsed by the department. It's an internal call for submission to make proposal towards an inclusive and architectural curriculum. Now, it looks like some kind of you know, classic mining, you know, existing works, or like mining the work of people to kind of to your own benefit. In fact, it does that, but it's much more than that, because to ask to make a call for an inclusive architectural curriculum is per se a criticism of the existing one by nature, because that's basically what it does. It's also empowering students and junior faculty because it's targeted strictly to assistants. Professor can apply, but they need an assistant as their head of the project. So it's the aim is to basically propose not an additional curriculum, but additional courses which would address all these aspects that are actually not addressed by the current curriculum. So we always talk about this idea of questioning the canon. So for those who are at the beginning of the talk, and that collage, that is also what it's about. So typically those who have written the canon suppress the work and practices of others deemed unworthy because of gender, sexual orientation, geographic origin, ethnicity, social background, etc. But the world is changing, and so we're asking for that. And the reason why we chose Minette da Silva is very telling. I think it's something that, and I was talking about this with Khensani earlier today, that it's also for people who are just very much into architecture only and who don't see any point in all of this. You've been cheated in your studies, basically. You have not received a complete education. You don't know who's Minette da Silva. I mean, I always give this example because that was for me a kind of an epiphany, or like Jeffrey Bava for what it matters. You know, I mean, I think people in the UK are maybe more informed, but I mean, these are people that are not in the canon that have produced outstanding architectural works. And they're just an example. There are many others out there that we don't know about. And in a way, for those who claim not to care, well, you've just been cheated. Sorry, you did not receive the architectural education that you probably would have deserved. So just to say that there is a myriad of entry points into this question, and that is just one of the ones that you can argue for, because this is a grant that's tapping on existing money from the ETH for betterment of teaching. So that's exactly what we are arguing for. And in line with that, I pass to the next slide, which shows another example of how you can actually address this question in a kind of not super frontal manner. So Dubravka, do you want to develop a little bit?
Yeah. So for
and
me,
I think we stop after that.
Yeah. So for me, what is interesting is how do we address these issues without necessarily creating a small, like niches in which, like, okay, we are looking into these forgotten practices or that, but how do we actually start to address these issues from fundamentals? And where I teach, I had a like great opportunity to develop a course with my colleagues Anusha Kehar and Milica Tomic, which was called Farbenlehre, What Color is the Sacred? This is an introductory course in artistic practice, where the entry for the bachelor students, and the image that is used is a painting developed by or made by Milica Tomic and developed based on a research on transformation of property rights in south of Styria, south of Austria, by which happened when National Socialism was on power, Nazis were on power in Austria. They used blood and soil as ideology, and they reinscribed property relations. And this is based on the research of Philip Sattler, who I think is also in the audience. So this we are playing here. No, we are using this idea of the color as one of the fundamentals we engage in artistic and architectural practice, but we put this on a head. And the entry point into this course is this painting, which discusses property and relations and how they are changed under different ideologies. And the first class is all about the inability of color film to record non-white skin. So kind of product in it. And this is our entry point for the fourth semester bachelor students who think, oh, we're just gonna do art. And by the end of the course, we discuss with them, which is research-driven course, we discuss with them the violence of the grid, we discuss settler colonialism, we discuss class inequalities, we discuss indigo riots because they are assigned to research a history of one pigment. And we read together with students, although there is 120 of them, and we use methods such as silent conversations in order to give ways that those who don't feel confident to speak up in front of 120 people start to speak up. For me, this course has been really something that I'm super proud about, how one can really see this transformation in the ways students start to see issues, and how then all of a sudden, I don't need to tell them what are the problems with Neufert and the standards, because they come and say, well, this Neufert thing was developed during Nazi period, and how come this is still a standard? And I think that then I start to have hope that we might not need to talk about these things in 30 years.
It's all about hope, about hope.
But let's
so just thank you. I think I have just compiled a few resources, because there is actually let's say that there are myriad of efforts, and I think it would be very interesting to also try to collaborate more. But in any case, there is this fantastic Space and Race reading list, which is all about reading. So it's about more resources, piling up resources. Other schools have been trying to do that. The Barthes at UCL with this Race and Space new curriculum, Race, Space and Architecture as well, and more, let's say, from a wider spectrum, the works of Dach. And very recently, actually last week, Black feminists in architecture, and of course the work of Matriarchy. So I think I would say with that we could have a bit of a larger conversation with Khensani, and then we can maybe take some questions. Khensani, would you like to maybe say a few words about your work so that we can also contextualize and then have a conversation? I mean, there are several things we talked about, how we want to contextualize this in the current situation, but also maybe have a critical conversation about intersectionality. And yeah, I'm sure that there are also other questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and yes, you should talk.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I think there's a lot, of course, there's a lot to speak about in respect to all of the content that the Parity Group have done, and of course that you presented. I think to just contextualize the work that Matriarchy does, we're again also not an officialized entity per se, or let's say an institutionalized entity where we go by collective. We're based between Switzerland and South Africa. I co-run it with a good friend. She's an architect based in Basel, Switzerland, Solange Mbanefo. And we gear our efforts towards empowering African women in the realm of architecture, from spatial education, from that point in university, towards remaining consistently present in the profession, which is really painfully lacking, at least in South Africa. I mean, out of under 10,000 architects registered, only 182 are women of color. So it says a lot about where we're at the moment. And I don't want to be redundant, but I think that's something that Dubravka kind of got into, intersectionality, a buzzword. I think we have come across it specifically in the last few days quite a lot. And an important buzzword, needless to say, which I think we owe it to Kimberly Crenshaw, who defined it in 1989, critical race theorist in the States, dealing with justice. And yeah, it's critical race theory that discusses the intersections between gender, race, class, and other forms of oppression that perpetuate or maintain hegemony and discrimination and oppression. So it's a default state, in a sense. And so I think it is quite interesting to see the type of work that we can all take upon ourselves, be it as an academic in an institution, be it as someone who's working in practice, or within a collective kind of space, and that there are various scales. And I suppose, Charlotte, interrupt me when you think you feel fit, but by scalability, it's really, or we discuss quite a lot in matriarchy, how that links back to whiteness as an institution, and then white people inheriting whiteness by default. And so white people with good intentions are great. That's exactly what we need. We need to join forces, I suppose, and white people and black lives and white lives are all very nuanced, all very different. And so intersectionality doesn't solely benefit the previously oppressed. In fact, if anything, it could make and optimize our ways of researching context-specific projects. And so at the University of Cambridge, where I'm currently reading an MPhil in architecture and urban design, there's quite a center or a focus on field work, which is also happening at the ETH. I mean, I'm sure for those of you who know, there are a series of summer schools that happen, and these certain chairs take a group of students to places, and there is, of course, room for benefit, but of course we haven't optimized it yet, because who has access to that information, and what is the research method, the research outputs, and in what medium is it deemed accessible? And so, yeah, the examples that Dubravka, that you discussed with Oslo, for example, the library and alternative library, where you can kind of receive information in a different way, and the archive in itself as a chronological record of let's say, surveying sites and then looking at them from the top down is already questioned by virtue of experiencing and discussing and learning, exchanging rather than speaking at and receiving from. And so I suppose my biggest sort of concern within the whole kind of discourse that's happening right now is the misuse of intersectionality as a term. Of course, we're all very well versed with or becoming more and more well versed with the lexicon and the jargon that comes with critical race theory. But lest we forget the very practical sorts of moves that can be made, which Charlotte's presented in what the Parity Group has sort of demanded from the ETH, which is looking at professorships, looking at who you hire, who you recognize, who you even collaborate with. I mean, I present an example which is happening at Columbia Graduate School of Design, which is two professors, Mario Gooden, Mabel Wilson, who've been running a Global Africa Lab for quite a while. I'm not quite sure when it began, but I'm inclined to say 2012 or so. And they took their students to Johannesburg 1 year. And when they did that, they made it a mission to collaborate with local stakeholders, and not just local respondents, but local architects who would then do a sort of post-evaluation of that work a few months down the line, or the next year review that sort of studio, that sort of way of learning. And then you've got a way of not simply extracting information, but also it benefiting on both sides. And so whether it be 3 students who are diverse in the institution, and it's quite absurd that that when in the response to students asking about a westernized or a Western
Eurocentric curriculum.
But I think that this also comes with understanding that it's like sexiness of like especially big, like kind of powerful especially financially powerful architecture schools, and projects that are so keen on like, you know, going somewhere and trying to fix somewhere else's problem. And for me, one of the most kind of like one of these moments in which everything kind of reveals itself was, I don't know, 15 years ago, when I was part of some workshop in Rotterdam, and we were walking around Tarweweg, which is and like we all know, like, you know, Dutch architecture scene established itself, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, by having access to incredibly well-funded Dutch cultural projects. We all kind of, you know, I come from Serbia, we all benefited from that. And this idea that architects go and somewhere else. And then we are in Tarweweg, which is 2 kilometers by air, the most, from, at that time, still Netherlands Architecture Institute, walking around, being explained by a Polish social worker that, okay, in that house, there are 20 people living, Polish migrant workers living, who are at that moment already EU citizens. But they sign a contract in Poland that they will come to Netherlands and work and be provided housing, which bypasses local Dutch laws, which after Second World War, when they realized, oh, that maybe having your employers renting you house is a source of exploitation. So you are not allowed to rent to your employers or like to have company housing and stuff in Netherlands. But people sign contracts in Poland, they come as migrant Polish workers in Netherlands, and then they're like 20, 30 in houses. And I was like, why on earth are these Dutch architects going all around the world, coming to Belgrade to explain us how we are really bad in doing our urban planning without and all this, where this is literally happening in their in their backyard. And I think that intersectionality, if it doesn't become a label, the same way, like, you know, the colonization almost became a label, but it's really not necessarily understood as a kind of continuous process, can open up this, because it is also like first part of intersectionality is really, where am I, from which position I'm part of some conversation. And for me, this is, you know, I'm white, but I was born in Yugoslavia, which fell apart. So now in Serbia, which is non-EU, I can't, you know, I lost jobs that I couldn't get because I don't have EU passport, but they're still white.
But don't you think that it's also the job of the ones that don't come from this background? I mean, I'm a white woman from a relatively privileged background. You know, I studied. I mean, I just happen to be a woman, so that makes me a kind of, discriminated for a certain amount of reason, but I'm fairly privileged, and I think that this is a call that we've seen happening across this whole conversation in the past week, with the tragedy that happened in the US, is that in a way it's also a call for action to the people who are actually not in the position of recognizing all these things, but in a way also to say that the ones who are actually sitting in this, I mean, in my case, I'm not really in position of power, but the little power I took in a way to also try to change things. And I mean, we also had this conversation about the dangerousness of that, and there has been some but in a way you also think that you do it for the love of the profession, you do it for the love of the institution, you do it because it's not okay how it is, and I think that this is something, if you talk about excellency, then where is the excellency in not teaching students, Swiss students, that their built environment is partially benefited and built on slavery. I mean, the Swiss people too today don't realize or don't even acknowledge that this country was involved in slavery because they didn't have colonies. So there is an entire strand of conversation that is just completely, absent. So, and this is just one, like the whole discussion on who builds what, the kind of like migrant labor conversation, even the know-how of architectural construction is completely ignored. And this is why this discussion about the canon is so important, because it is also about it's for the sake of the profession and of the discipline, really. I mean, it's also, I think that there is nothing more exciting for someone who is, I mean, it's exciting and frustrating at the same time to realize that there is an immense body of work out there that you have no idea about. And in the end, I think that this whole conversation, it merged, no? It's merging with representation, with fairness, with equality, with a better inclusion of society, that the ones who design the built environment are mirroring to a certain extent the ones that are actually using it. And here we're also talking about able bodies or non-able bodies, who is actually using the space. So all these kind of broader questions, but also the fact that this is for the sake of the discipline in the end. I mean, actually that's where I also come from. I'm angry about a lot of other things, but I also feel that this is also about the relevance of the profession and its quality, in fact.
Completely. I think quality and opportunity of the sort of architectural education to optimize on not necessarily just the history of how all of the sort of contexts that we stay in came to be, but also equally the sort of occupancy of the places that we find ourselves in. I mean, Counterspace Studio, who were just selected to do the 20th century, right. I mean, the 20th anniversary for the second time. Billion. Oh. Their proposal was very interesting in how it provoked, and yes, an inclusion of multiple of diverse groups, which are many migrant communities in London. I'm sure Whitechapel, East London, it's extremely diverse, but at the same time, placing an emphasis on how the very collective and dynamic identity of London, that is how it feels. So the interaction between how spaces are used and adopted and changed in relation to their form is sort of one of the reasons for that is because of these migrant communities, and they need not necessarily be recipients of that, but also, I mean, they should not just be recipients of that, but also recognized as much as other people are prioritized in that space. So I think we're sort of for me at least, I think we're facing a huge challenge where it's being on the scale of the architect and really like the home, the domestic situation, and then these little rooms that we're all in right now, and then scaling up to the institution and who enables and who unlocks. I mean, within the sort of the room that you have, what asking oneself, which I've asked myself multiple times, and as you've mentioned, Charlotte, you have as well, is asking yourself how you can instrumentalize change to reflect the very diverse communities that we're surrounded by. And it's, I mean, I say opportunity in the sense that, yeah, especially with institutions like ETH, Cambridge, I mean, we can go on at length about all of the top 20, top 10, blah, not even, but yeah, these are who, when people graduate, when people leave the institution, where does that labor market go? And that's the fundamental information that they learn there either restricts the amount of places that they are able to contribute to. You're just teaching Swiss students what architecture in Switzerland means. The opportunity within a global world, which we have to acknowledge we all subscribe to, completely decreases. And then you've got diverse students who are moving around. So it might be that you're from Hungary and you go and study in England, or you're whatever, you go to whatever place you do, but you're not local to that place, there's a contribution that you bring with you in expectation that there'll be a knowledge exchange, not necessarily assuming that we're hyper contextual when in fact we are extremely global. And so there's a labor force that we could really optimize it and make quite efficient by simply extending the ways in which we archive information, architectural information. It's quite tactile and disseminate it. And then also the content itself, the curriculum itself. It's sort of, I sometimes question if this is 2020.
Are there questions? Because I don't know, I think we are over time already, so I don't know if there are any questions. Rosie, are you?
I don't see any yet.
I mean, for me,
people are overwhelmed.
If I can just chime in. For me, what is like, there's this, like, we need, like, who defines is on power, and then I think that this is one big challenge. And this is really something that I really, believe in architecture, because, like, there are so many other professions where we, like, engage with space on the level of the human interaction. And we can see this playing out in the last couple of months so much, this moment in which, no, I don't want to talk about social distancing, I want to talk about physical distancing. I don't want to talk about the density is a problem, but actually overcrowdedness is a problem, because we can have cities, we can live which are dense, but without having the necessarily health issues, because we are not overcrowded, because certain people have, thousands of square meters for themselves, and certain people have 1 square meter for themselves. So it's really about how do we, but I think it's also when it comes, this really is how do I make students subjectivize, that they start to understand this, not because I told them, because I'm an authority or I'm not, but because they have to start to connect these dots. And when we think about architecture history, I have one agenda, that when people hear Manchester, they think Mississippi. That behind Manchester and, housing crisis, like the birth of, we all reach, like, behind Manchester, there is Mississippi. That in the US or Canada, when people say architecture, they think settler colonialism. When people hear property, they understand a colonial tool of dispossession. Mm-hmm. This is my agenda as an educator, but it doesn't work if I just bang this to my students, because it doesn't come like that, because then someone else can bang some other propaganda into their head, and then we have.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Kens, you wanted to add something. Yeah, no, I just, I think it's so interesting how also each of us have a different perception of how these things are kind of playing out. I also wonder what we want to think when people hear Le Corbusier. Would they automatically think macho, fascist? I mean, I've been educated in Marseille, where this the master was hovering over our heads all the time, and that's maybe why the collage was kind of showing the Villa Savoie being under a satellite, under a meteorite. But yeah, I think it's I think there are multiple. There are so many possibilities to basically deconstruct that curriculum, and for everyone who is, like, invested into education to actually just chip bit by bit to the kind of to chip away from the canon is actually something that I think could be on the long run working. And I think that it would also need nevertheless for a kind of awareness at some kind of at top level, where there is a kind of remise en question on what do you actually teach, no? And I mean, we've always made fun of the fact that some of our professors have been teaching the same material shamelessly years over years without even changing a slide. Same content every semester. So this is something that I also, when you talk about excellency, you also wonder, you know, who is checking on these people somehow and on their content. And in the end, the students are doing a great job when they're asking these kind of questions, you know, like, why is your curriculum so Eurocentric? I think that was a great question, and I'm very happy that students are actually also taking up that kind of role.
Charlotte, could I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Just to widen out beyond the conversation around academic institutions. I mean, I run a cultural institution, and in the past I've edited magazines. How do you think this conversation can usefully, you know, how can you engage those sorts of institutions which also play such a fundamental part in defining the culture of architecture?
No, but I think there are kind of basic stuff that are that everyone should look at. I mean, when you're publishing a magazine and you're putting together an event, you also should keep an eye on your gender ratio and on your diversity ratio. And this is just a question of representation, but probably to a certain extent, we'll also give you a broader kind of spectrum regarding the kind of conversation that you will have, I think. So that's kind of a very basic thing, which we've experienced as something that actually works to broaden your discussion spectrum. Then I think that institutions also have a certain duty. I mean, architecture institutions here in Switzerland are catering to, I mean, we were discussing catering to young male architects who are able to get out of the house to actually attend an event at, you know, 7 o'clock. I mean, I can't. I have a 4-year-old, and, you know, I cannot just, you know, go. So, you know, at what time do you schedule your event? You know, are you assuming that only a certain portion of the population is going to come? And then what do you want to talk about? No? I think that this is, if you sit in your chair, and I'm assuming that you have a certain agency over the content of what you can curate, it's also your responsibility. And I think that the Architectural Foundation did a great job by launching that kind of call, which is very much about the responsibility of architects as designers of the environment, but beyond that, as just citizens, you know. So I think that there was already a very good sign that we should join the conversation, not just as educators, but as cultural producers, and as just like as people, you know. I mean, but maybe Dubravka and Khensani also have a say. I'm not the expert. I'm just an annoying activist.
For me, I think we desperately need a new kind of spatial social contract. The one that is not based on Rousseau and this, but like the one that is really based on the 21st century conditions. I mean, what's happening. And I think that the public institutions, the institutions that intervene, that have one foot in certain practice in architecture, but are actually kind of have another foot in public. Like we need to also kind of create a public sphere anew. And I think that this is incredible. And then you know, public programming, exhibiting, thinking about publishing, not traditionally but also differently, is really important. It's really important. One part of what, for example, which is always part of the institute where I work, is Institute for Contemporary Art, exhibiting and making things public is always a part of the work with the students. We have research, even on a bachelor level, we do research-driven courses, which there is a moment in which they have to start about exhibiting, which is not I print a poster and I put my research on the poster, but it's really about what kind of a public sphere we want to address with this and create. And it's incredible responsibility, I think, of all of us, especially if we are in the public institutions or institutions that have a possibility to talk to or to create the new public public, because we are also completely atomized. And in a bizarre level, Zoomification also opened up this possibility that we can have these conversations that, you know, that it's just up to my, you know, it's up to my capacity, which fortunately is big, that I can stay awake at night, and then I can zoom in into the architecture's lobby teaching about, which is made on the Earth Day. And that I can be this, or that I can kind of ask a question to Mabel Wilson about her work when it comes to documenting slavery and lynching in memorialization and this. So we have this thing in which we are bizarrely starting to have more quality conversations because in these atomized situations and that we are than we do when we meet in physical space, because I think we are also confronted with this urgency on a completely different. And I am really, how do we build? I mean, I'm kind of today I'm banking on this, my personal thing, but I went through this disappearance of a state and disappearance of a kind of any kind of contract that existed within any kind of social contract that exists in this state, and inability to rebuild public conversation. And I think that this is fundamental, because if we think that architecture is about space, it's about relation, and how do we do?
Yeah. Okay. I think there's a question.
Yeah.
I'll just unmute Cyril.
Okay, yes.
Hi.
Hi, Dubravka and Charlotte.
Hello.
Khensani.
Hello, Sao Paulo.
Hello, concrete behind.
You come to make trouble. Thank you for the collage.
Thank you for the collage.
You're welcome. No, thank you for the talk. It was really nice. No, what I was thinking, I mean, especially after your talk and these days, you know, there's always these adjectives before the architecture, no? So it's like Latin architecture, African architecture, and things like that. And I would like to ask you, like in the experience that I sense that the European institutions, they always expect people or scholars from other places of the world to come teach and only talk about their contexts. So if there's a Latin professor, he should only talk, a Brazilian professor, he should only talk about Brazilian architecture. Someone from South Africa should only talk about South Africa. While I see in the opposite side, European architects, you know, speaking very openly about also Brazilian architecture, Latin architecture, and other subjects. So I would like to ask you about this. Like, how do you see this thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is super valid, because I mean, it's you have in fact the embodiment of the situation here. No, Dubravka is writing her dissertation on ex-Yugoslavian, I mean, actually Yugoslavian construction industry, and I have published my dissertation on Cairo. So here you go. I think that this is actually a really relevant question. You're also going to replicate that, because you're going to be working on Brasilia, which then I ask myself, would you have received the proposal? So it's just a question. It's like, does it mean that the people who decide somewhere, in your case, it's because actually both Dubravka and yourself, you're in a situation where a European institution has accepted you to study and become a kind of a scholar of that particular aspect with that project already, right? So I wonder if you would have had been accepted, if you would have said, I'm going to look at you know, public space in Berlin. I just wonder if the awareness of the kind of bias that are existing about these things is even there. And actually, I don't think so. And I think that it makes no sense. Of course, I mean, why? Because this is something you build the expertise. I mean, come on, everyone who started to research on something knew nothing about that thing. Everyone has kind of built up a research. It depends on certain aspects, of course. But in my case, I can fairly say that I had no clue about what I was researching. Yeah, Khensani wants to say something, but she's mute, I think.
I'm muted. Can you hear me?
Now you can. Yeah. But I mean, this is just my own. I actually have more question than I would have an answer. I just think that the bias are very strong, and this is, if you wished to actually pulverize that kind of understanding, I think that would be also very interesting. Sorry. So yes, Khensani, sorry.
I mean, mine will be short. I think that in response to your question, Ciro, I'm extremely fascinated with this as well, because I think that there's an assumption about expertise linked to locality, particularly, let's say newly liberated places in the world, or whatever that history was. But at the same time, I think that there is a lot of value in collaborating. I mean, this is something that our program focuses on a lot at Cambridge, which is thematic collaboration. And that's the intersectionality of the research method, not necessarily the intersectionality of, I'm an African woman, I have to go pair up with an African woman, and we're going to, of course, it's not that literal, but and not assuming that was what anyone was thinking, but I think more along the lines of what is happening right now in the United States, for example, is something extremely familiar to South Africans. I mean, and I'm sure many other sites, but I'm not well versed in that myself. And when there's a spatial interest that one can provide and then bring to that other site, let's call it me going to the United States, I think the reciprocation is the part at which it's either going to be progressive or it's going to be white supremacist, like oppressive. Let's not say white supremacist, but oppressive, which is, we can see it now that there's a risk of misrepresentation if, let's say, Western-centered institutions do work without the inclusion of, let's say, oppressed or previously oppressed sites, but then at the same time, there's an extreme exhaustion from the other side, and a wantingness to, or let's say, a desire to want to just be an architect who focuses on a bathtub or something, or focuses on the bathroom, or focuses on something completely devoid of social issues, and that there isn't much room. At least I found that there isn't much room to explore.
I don't think there is anything devoid from social issue. Actually, the bathroom is highly a minefield.
But I think that there is like a Sima wrote a really interesting question, and I would like maybe that you can ask that question. And also Daniela, I saw Daniela. Hi, Daniela, raising hand, and I think that
it's great. It's great to have like. Daniela was first, I think.
So I
can
unmute. Sorry.
Thank you.
I didn't know we have.
No, thank you. Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I would just thank you very much, Ciro, for raising this question, because I think it helps a lot. I would like to just share a very concrete case of an example that things are much more complicated than actually just choosing a topic because of your own background and interest. It has to do with also other forces. Who is funding your research and how they want to pay for you? So when I went to Switzerland as a Brazilian young scholar proposing a topic, one of the first institutions I've applied for a scholarship was the so-called Swiss embassy scholarship provided by the Swiss embassy. So you had to apply directly to the Swiss embassy of your own country. And then I applied, and then I was shortlisted and went to the interview. And the first thing that a diplomat came to me and approached and said, "Wow, how fantastic. You are going to the ETH, you are already enrolled as a PhD student, but you are studying modern architecture, you're studying Le Corbusier, Brazilian artists, anthropophagia. Why don't you study else? I mean, why? I mean, this is a poor country, we need research on favelas." And I said, yeah, absolutely. But I'm not changing my topic to sound very good to institution to support I didn't get this grant. I got the SNF afterwards. But I was the reserve candidate in case one of those actually was withdrawing it. But I was shocked about the question. I mean, I know it was not the intention of the diplomat as part of the jury, but after that I was so shocked because it has also to do with the fact that how nice and how convenient and opportunistic is for specific funding agencies to support in a specific moment certain topics. So how scholarship should not be so opportunistic, and how to combine opportunism in a positive way, to make visible this very important agendas. So yes, I first encountered myself as a Latin American when I stepped my foot into European territory. And then I discovered I was Latin American, because in Brazil, you never study Latin American architecture to start with. I don't know, Cyril, have you ever had a course on Latin American architecture? I'm sorry, we don't learn this in public universities or high quality university schools in Brazil. I mean, this is nonsense, But just to make it a bit more complicated, but I wanted to add the question of the who is funding, so it's very, very complicated.
Yeah, no, thank you, Daniela. This is great. And I mean, I think it was, I mean, your research is anyway extremely important with this kind of like debunking of the myth of like Corbusier going to Brazil and like inventing all these things. And I think it's really a very fantastic story. And I hate Le Corbusier, so I'm always happy when someone is working on working in deconstructing the myth. So no, great, yeah. Dubravka, you said there was another question, right?
I am muted.
I don't know.
I hope that I'm pronouncing your name.
Yeah.
If you want to ask your question.
Firstly, yes, again, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And it was something that I think we all needed to hear, especially from you three women that are leading it in your own ways, uniquely, and somehow compensating and completing each other's discourses. Maybe just to, I really liked the question that Daniela just responded to, because this was something that came up at a similar conference that happened in November last year, where it was Africa and the 21st century in disciplines, in the space of African-related disciplines in comparison to European or Eurocentric disciplines. And the question was really, why is it that a Swiss person or a German person can go to Egypt or Syria or Lebanon and do a PhD, or in some place that's completely foreign to them, or in a language that has nothing to do with their upbringing, and their understanding of the language is completely based on local translators, on local help that probably don't even get mentioned in the whole process. And someone from a foreign point of view coming into the Eurocentric system or institutions to study has to always go back and do their specialization of where they come from. And we had a lot of debates with students that were from different parts of Africa that were like, someone would say, I'm from Zimbabwe, but I want to study something in China. And I don't see why it can't be possible if a German person can study somewhere in Mozambique. And this is a bias that people have, because apparently you must do good to the people that have less or don't have access to what you need to have access to, which is, at the end of the day, if you're not motivated genuinely to do that kind of research, nobody is Mother Teresa that has this, because you had the opportunity to study at ETH, you must study back in your home country, because it is freedom of speech, freedom of intellect, freedom of choice. And this is something that is still a very new, unspoken topic, where a Black student is probably studying something in Singapore. You probably wouldn't see that. You would probably see someone from Singapore studying something in Singapore, or a white person studying something in Singapore. And the quality of that research is always very questionable. But at the end of the day, aren't we all here to learn? But so I also see the different point of view. So I agree with Daniela's comment on that sense, but it's also about really like seeing things in the sense of, if you're not genuinely interested, it's not because you come from a place that you're genuinely interested in helping. And the quality of what comes out of it is different. So maybe a Chinese person studying something in Congo, because that Chinese person is really interested, the quality would be different than someone from Congo that's actually not interested in that and actually has an interest for, I don't know, ballet houses or ballet rooms in, you know, in Austria would have a completely different approach in doing that research, because at the end of the day, we're human beings and we all have access to an amount of information in an age of IoT. So that's something that we also need to grasp. Secondly, my question that I put in was, you know, it's great to talk about intersectionality, about diversity, about, you know, how many women are professors. The question is, how do you prove this as a point, knowing that we're human beings, we're looking for opportunity, we're looking for self-gratification, we're looking for power, we're looking for something that you can profit from. Everyone is profit-driven in the sense of, what am I going to learn from this? Why do we read certain books? Why do we follow certain architects? Because we know that their reputation and what they did, I can learn from it. I can enhance my design quality from that. Wouldn't it be interesting to maybe do a, I don't know, like a survey on, does it make a difference on the quality of having a female professor? One, or two, what does it mean by knowing that you can actually show people Ottoman architecture, Egyptian architecture, architecture from Zambia, from Zaria, from South Africa, from Nigeria, from Senegal, from Cuba, from Latin America, in different parts? What does it change to the quality of the architectural student that has access to more information? That student will be broader, have a broader understanding of culture diversity, and the world is based on cultural diversity. So the fact of the matter is, by showing simple examples of what they have never seen, of very high quality architecture that has been done everywhere in the world by men and women everywhere, we don't even need to say this. People will be hungry to understand. As you said, Charlotte, in your presentation, you have been cheated. There's so much information that you do not know that great, incredible maestros of architecture have done, that has been swept under the carpet in the name of superiority and colonialism and power. At the end of the day, power and resources. So why wouldn't we like try and show this and just be like, hey guys, by the way, this is this myriad of stuff that you guys don't know. You don't have to join. But the fact is, you know nothing. Your level is here. And there's like a level that's 1,000 plus, because the population of the world is so diverse. And just by showing that diversity, you will be already showing by doing, and people would be craving to learn more and get that diversity that they're missing. And it would probably be like a domino effect. This is something that I think would be something interesting to kind of invest in, or like expose more in that sense, more literally.
No, absolutely. But I think this is also what this argument about the kind of, to go back to the just simple question about the Eurocentric curriculum, is just that these examples of great architecture that you talk about, they don't make it into the canon. So yeah, Khensani, sorry, I see you want to talk.
I mean, it's maybe following on to what you've said. I think it's prototype based. I suppose I've spoken to Solange about this at length as well, so it's a little bit it's a little bit of a cross conversation. But how do you show someone things in their peripheral vision that they haven't seen before? It's kind of, you have to catalyze something, and then that change starts to unfold. And so I suppose using an example would be things like the Parity Group, things like BFA in the UK right now, like non-institutionalized organizations that are able to adopt to a quicker change in context, which is, we see that the world changing so fast, whereas the institution is beholden to a certain time frame, which maybe it can learn, as you've said in this question, Solange, by doing and testing.
But I think
there is also one small example that I just want to bring in, because Ciro is here, and I think there is also something for those of us who actually teach design that is related to the kind of references that you actually give, no? Because I think that's, I mean, for me, in my case, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't know, and then, I mean, I got more acquainted to Brazilian, to Latin American architecture, in fact. No, I'm kidding. I mean, I will never use that word, but like Brazilian architecture, and then it's just something that I was not exposed to. Again, I was cheated. Typical. I didn't know about a lot of stuff, and then when I went back to teaching my studio, I was like, actually, have you seen the roof of Fal? You know, like I would just bring up stuff that are amazing that people don't know about. And then it's just so, it's also about the impregnation to this, all this stuff that Solange was mentioning are amazing that we have not known about. And as educator, especially people who teach design, are able to make a difference to students when they just show these examples, you know. I think this is, I mean, for me, this is the most efficient almost.
But I think in this context, what is also important is, like, for example, yeah, there are like, but there are also blind spots which we don't have, which we don't necessarily consider because we have a specific, not only our gender, but also class upbringing. So we don't pay, no, so like we don't pay attention to certain spaces, or we don't consider them as important because we don't necessarily have this check in our head that this is, you know, the issue. Zero and Charlotte curated Sao Paulo Biennial on the topic of maintenance, and I taught a course on maintenance and management of Kunsthaus Graz, the Peter Cook kind of friendly alien, where we spent weeks going through the building, and, you know, we crawled into every single space with students and stuff in order to, and then this completely changes, you know, like this changes your perception of this building, and you also understand what was taught about and what was not taught about, and so how do we flip this, and just that someone, you know, you have to have, then that's why intersectionality is important. You have to have people from working class entering, entering into architecture schools in order to open certain type of topics, what needs to be kind of addressed, because this is not considered architecture, because, you know, that because it's outside and stuff, because we also have this, you know, we tend to teach capital A architecture in architecture schools, which are now fortunately broadening the geographical canon, but we are still mostly teaching capital A architecture, and then we look at lowercase a architectural built environment and something that we need to fix. This is still in a way I mean, we are going, I'm now oversimplifying and making kind of binaries, but what for me is this question, like, who does this? Like, it's also this, I think that what we are also having is this, with the environmental crisis, this became in collapse, this became, oh, we Westerners, we don't know how to fix this, so can you indigenous people tell us how to do it? So we extract your knowledge, we found yet another thing we can extract from you, so give us your knowledge, because we can't. And, you know, this kind of like, I have to be able to educate myself as well, and not just, not necessarily all the time ask that someone gives me first resources, then labor, and now give. So, and then I feel, when I'm saying this, I feel also really unmoored, because all the conversations really benefit from the context in which, from like specific context in which they are being. The conversation about suburbia is completely different in the US and in the rest of the world, but we tend to look it through the scholarship that was produced in the US. Similarly, like, just for a certain part of feminists was important to, part of emancipation was introduction of women into labor, or starting to work, because a lot of other women never had an opportunity, never had the luxury not to work. But we did not design cities thinking that thinking cities from their position. What does it mean, the big push in Europe, that, you know, Europe, like, oh, let's put bike lanes everywhere. Yeah, but I don't want bike lanes if that means less investment in public transport. Again, underprivileged people who are poor, working class, usually of immigrant background, because they usually live much further away from their places of work. So they have to commute more. So they have to spend more of their body energy, and they have to have able bodies. If we say, okay, we put bike lanes, so we kind of don't expand buses. So I think it's yeah, sorry, it's complicated, but I think it's possible.
Great. Good to know.
I rest my case.
Very good. Okay, yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to say something. Otherwise, I think maybe Khensani, you want to say.
It's very short. It's very short. I think it's almost echoing what Dubravka said earlier in the presentation, and it's reestablishing, really even remolding contractual agreements. And I don't necessarily mean that literally, but you know, when one, because there's an opportunity in, for instance, identifying that a lot of, let's say as an example, African construction methods are good for certain locations that are similar to that and climatically responsive. But the assumption that it's extraction by default would, if that's flipped on its side, and the only thing that can maintain that agenda is the institution itself, like its planning bodies, architectural bodies, you know, the South African sort of, I can use examples from South Africa, but you know, the RIBA, the university you go to, again, like changing institutional values to by default encourage a collaborative contractual agreement rather than one that just benefits the institution that is running that. And I honestly, this is not a solution-based sort of discussion. I don't know where that begins, but I think that the back and forth prototyping of trying to use individual agency that is not institutionalized yet, because it has the ability to work on a fast time frame, and then slowly chip away, as you said, Charlotte, at the institution until there's something that's permanent in there that can at least maintain longevity once all of the good, or let's say once all of the progressive students and professors have left that institution.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really mean it by chipping away. I would like for something a little bit more radical, but
like meteorites falling.
Yeah, meteorites are great ways to kind of, you know, smash the status quo and the Villa Savoie, by the way. Sorry, I have an issue with that guy.